Now that we know how the Fed is going to use the three different monetary tools in order to combat the recessionary gaps, let's dive a little bit more into it. And we're going to throw off another graph here. And this graph is actually going to show the aggregate supply and the aggregate demand. And we're going to talk through this graph in this video. And we're going to talk about how combating recessionary gaps actually works. So we're going to use expansionary policies to increase aggregate demand. Remember that a recessionary gap occurs whenever the equilibrium of the market is below the full employment. So we want to actually reduce that recessionary gap by moving that equilibrium closer to full employment. So we're going to use expansionary policies to increase that demand. And we're in a recessionary gap anywhere like 82 or 81, 82, and 83, where the equilibrium, that intersection between the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply curve, is below that equilibrium of full employment. So we're down here at 81, 82, 83. So what are we going to do? We're going to use those expansionary policies in order to increase that aggregate demand. So consumption, investment, and government expenditures increase due to these expansionary monetary policies. We're going to go through those expansionary monetary policies that basically get people to buy more things, get companies to invest more. We're lowering the interest rates, increasing the availability of loans. People are going to be buying more. As they buy more, it increases that overall aggregate demand. So what happens if we're increasing that aggregate demand and we shift that aggregate demand actually from AD1 to AD2? We go from AD1 over here to AD2. And remember, we're actually in this part of that aggregate supply curve, that part where the prices really don't change all that much, but at the same token, output can change quite a bit. So what happens is we move from AD1 to AD2. Well, the first thing is aggregate output shifts from Y1 to Y2. We're increasing the overall aggregate demand. We're using those expansionary monetary policies to basically increase the availability of loans, get people buying more. It's going to increase that aggregate demand overall, and it increases the output. As people begin to buy more, our output goes up. More workers are needed to produce these goods, so the slack in the economy and the prices, so as more people are needed to produce these goods, we actually get closer to operating under that full employment that we're trying to target by reducing these recessionary gaps. So the slack in the economy and the prices remain the same. So what we see is that the prices really don't change. They're still down here at this P0 because we're still operating in this part of that supply, that aggregate supply curve, to where the prices really aren't going to change here. Remember, the aggregate supply curve is elastic there, to where these changes in the aggregate demand is actually not going to affect the price, but we're going to increase our output. So changes in price, that's also known as inflation. So we're able to actually increase output, get more people working in this particular situation, and we're not changing the prices. So it's a win-win. We're not facing inflation, but yet we have more people working, we're producing more, things are going better. And what we're doing is we're reducing that inflationary gap from this YFE to Y1. That was the original inflationary or recessionary gap whenever we're back here at this point, at this equilibrium. But now we're over here at this equilibrium, so our recessionary gap is actually falling. We're moving closer to our target of full employment. So we just shifted from AD1 to AD2. But did we go far enough? Well, no, we didn't. We were able to increase output. We got more people working. All of that is fantastic. That is great. But we're still not at this full employment. So what are we going to do? Well, we're actually going to stimulate the economy again. We're going to impose another set of expansionary policies to try and move us closer to that full employment. The Fed is going to enact another set of monetary policies, and they're going to shift us from AD2 to AD3. So what happens as we shift from AD2 to AD3? First off, we shift to aggregate demand 3, and that actually shifts our output to Y3. So again, because of these expansionary policies, we are producing more. As we produce more, we need more workers to produce these goods. we've got more people working. We're moving closer to that full employment aspect, and we're at this Y3. So we've increased output again, but we're no longer in this elastic portion of the aggregate supply curve. So as we shift from AD2 and going to AD3, we actually see an increase in prices. Prices go from this P0 to this P3. So that's going to show inflation. And actually inflation is the percentage change from P0 to P3. So now we're getting into a little bit of inflation. We're increasing our output, but prices are also rising, so we have a little bit of inflation. But here's what's going on. Real GDP, so that GDP that's adjusted for that inflation, is the percentage change from Y2 to Y3. So our real GDP is going up, and our real GDP is increasing faster than what our prices are increasing by. So in reality, even though our prices are going up, as an economy, we're still doing better because we're producing more than what our inflation would be. And again, our recessionary gap falls. Now our recessionary gap falls from YFE to Y3. That was a bad drawing. So our recessionary gap is actually shrinking. So what's happening? Well, we've shifted now from this recessionary gap to just this recessionary gap. Our expansionary policies, our expansionary monetary policies are increasing our aggregate demand, shifting it to the right. As it shifts to the right, we actually shrink our recessionary gaps. Now, have we reached our point of full employment yet? No. So we're still in a recessionary gap. Even at AD3, we're still at a recessionary gap. So what happens? Well, we're still going to try and combat that recessionary gap. So we stimulate the economy for another time, and we shift aggregate demand to aggregate demand 4. We've shifted that aggregate demand because of our expansionary policies. Now we're at aggregate demand 4. Lo and behold, the equilibrium of our economy is at this aggregate demand 4 is at that full employment. That is what we've been trying to accomplish this whole time. So we've used expansionary policies to move it from AD1 to AD2 to AD3 and then on to AD4, and now we are at full employment. So the aggregate output, the equilibrium of this economy, is at full employment. The recessionary gap has been eliminated. That's what we've been trying to do this whole time. But now prices are at P4. So they've gone up from P0 to P3. Now all of a sudden they make kind of a larger jump to P4 as we move closer to that full employment, or as we move to that full employment. So now the prices at level at P4, these are inflated prices, but the growth offsets this. So we have additional growth and additional price changes, but at this full employment, the additional growth, the additional workers, the additional growth in real GDP of our economy actually offsets this increase, this inflation in prices. So at this point, we have the lowest unemployment rate. We're at full employment. We have the lowest unemployment rate and the highest capacity utilization rate without triggering significant inflation. So whenever we are at full employment, we have the most amount of people working. We are producing at the right amount, and we do have some inflation going on, some inflated prices, but it's not triggering significant inflation. Matter of fact, the growth in our real GDP is overshadowing our price changes at this particular point. So this whole time we've been trying to combat recessionary gaps. Well, we were able to do that because we were able to move this economy from an equilibrium of less than full employment to full employment. So we've been able to effectively get rid of that recessionary gap by using these expansionary monetary policies. But what if we take it one step further? What if we stimulate the economy one more time with an expansionary policy and move it out to A5? Well, now this economy moves from full employment, shifts that aggregate demand. We move up the aggregate supply curve, and now we are at this Y potential, this Y pot. So that the Y potential is the potential capacity to supply goods and services. As we move from Y full employment to Y potential, we have an increase in prices, a rather large increase in prices, but we have a small increase in real GDP. So the benefits of production are overshadowed by inflation. After we get past this full employment aspect, if we still try to stimulate the economy, then we're actually increasing prices at a much faster rate than what we're producing those additional goods. So actually, in reality, inflation lowers the real wealth, and this economy will actually self-correct itself back to aggregate demand for. Once we get up to this point, it costs so much in prices that people will actually begin to stop buying as many goods because it costs so much, and the economy will actually shift back to this point right here, and we'll try to shift back to that full employment.